Okay, here's a quick tip for beginners. We had one request saying I'm very new to oil, and I will wonder if you'd consider doing a really beginner tutorial on how to get the oil to flow in the canvas like you do. She says mine is thick and I don't know how to thin it or what to use. I do. Let's see. So this one has two parts actually. So what do you do when the paint comes out? This is oil paint I'm talking about. What do you do when the paint comes out of the tube but it feels too thick? Now there are multiple brands of paint on the market. Some of those have very creamy paint. Brands like Gamblin and Rembrandt, you pretty much can depend upon for the paint to be very creamy and pliable and easy to brush when it comes out of the tube. But there's some other brands, I won't mention, that have a stiffer paint. Not only that, but once a paint settles into the tube for a long time, the oil will separate from it and it will become very stiff sometimes. So let's address that one first. What do? You won't, or I think for my purposes, the paint needs to feel about the consistency of maybe sour cream, a really good thick sour cream. I used to say hand cream, the kind that came in the jar, but I'm not sure if folks are using that anymore. But a consistency that feels right in your brush, that will behave the way you want it to behave. And so that's what you look for in the consistency of the paint. Now, I have a tube of Utrecht Hensel Yellow Light here that is a little stiff. Utrecht is a really good paint, but I do find that sometimes I get tubes where the paint is a little bit too stiff. Well, let me show you now. This is one way to solve the problem that that this person was talking about. So I would squirt a little bit of the paint, or however much you need for your what you're going to do on the canvas, on the palette rather, on the palette. Now, first of all, well, I always test it first with a brush to be sure or see how it feels. So I will say that feels a little stiff to me. So what do I do about that? Well, the oil paint is made with a combination of linseed oil, or most oil paints are. There are some that are special paints that have other additives in them, but I'm talking about traditionally. Most oil paint is made with linseed oil and pigment. So adding linseed oil, and that's refined linseed oil I'm talking about, adding linseed oil into this is a good way to get it the pliable, get that pliableness that we need. So here's the way I do that, and I find this works very well. If you just take an eyedropper and drop into the drop linseed oil, and you might put too much in. So I've found that I just take my palette knife, and this is my linseed oil. This is the Gamblin brand, which is my favorite brand of refined linseed oil. So I tilt the bottle like this, and I put my palette in so that it just the tip. You see that? Just the tip. See that little drop? That's what I'm looking for right there. So I adjust just the tip, about maybe a half inch up the tip, something like that, into the linseed oil, and then I bring that over and I just let it drop right there. Let it drop right there on the paint. Now, one drop at a time. If I were to take my palette knife with this linseed oil left on it and begin to work that in, I might have too much, so I need to dry the palette knife off first. Now what I need to do is to mix this. Now here's the way I do it. I have to mix this thoroughly, because at first it's going to be lumpy. So it's got to be absolutely thoroughly mixed, and this requires, it's the same way as softening butter. It just requires taking your palette knife and moving into it with the point of the palette knife, or with the tip of the palette knife. Keep moving into it, and you can feel it, sense how it feels against the palette knife. And when it feels that softness that you're accustomed to or that you need, then you've got your consistency. And of course what you would do there, once that consistency is thoroughly mixed, or once you have that consistency, then you put it wherever you want your paint to be. And of course mine would go right here, just like that. So that's the way you solve that part of the problem. But there's something else too, and that is the subscriber mentioned how smoothly it goes onto the canvas. If you begin a painting on a dry canvas, this is a freshly opened canvas and it's dry. If you begin your painting on a dry canvas, the paint's not going to flow smoothly on it. Now I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'll just get a color here that any color would work. And now if I stroke that on a dry canvas, you see what happens. It kind of skips, and I just have to keep pushing the paint into it to make it go on the dry canvas. Well, the best way to solve that problem is to dampen the surface very slightly. I use a mixture, I've talked about this before. It's a 50-50 mixture of poppy oil and Gamsol. You could also use a 50-50 mixture of linseed oil and Gamsol. The medium, you need about 50% medium and 50% solvent, so any combination would work. And so I'm going to show you the difference now. So I'll just come right here. Now I'll just spray just a little bit. Now that way, here's what you've got to be careful about. If it's too wet, it's going to just melt the paint as it goes on. I'll show you about that. If it's too wet, you see, it sort of just gets melted as it goes on. It turns it into a wash. So you don't want it too wet. So if you spray that surface down and then you go over it with paper towel, let me do that over here just to be sure I've got control of it. So give it a little spray, a little spritz over the whole canvas it would be, and go over it with paper towel and wipe it down pretty good. I always test it with my fingertips like this, and I'll see. And if I don't have very much oil, and you get used to how much after you practice this for a while, if I don't have very much oil on my fingertip, then I know it's going to work. Now I'll show you the difference. I'll use the same stroke as I used right here in the beginning, and you see how easily it goes on when you have that damp surface. The paint goes real easy, and that's probably the best advice I could give you between those two. Of course, the way you hold the brush, but you can hold the brush almost any way. You can hold it straight to the canvas. If the canvas is slightly damp, paint goes on well. You can hold it like perpendicular to the canvas, and it goes on. So once you have the canvas damp, damp enough but not too damp, it works. And the third thing I want to advise you is when you're going back to a piece that has already dried, it's the same thing. If this is a little painting I did about 4 years ago, and I'll put this here to give you an example of what I'm talking about. If I wanted to make, if I wanted to edit this little piece, if I wanted to change a few things, if I were to go on to this surface now as it is, first of all, the paint wouldn't want to go onto the surface. It would resist going on. Wet paint resists going onto a dry surface. So it would resist going onto that surface just like it does here. But there's another thing. Once the paint is dried, it needs a little bit of dampness in order to create a bond between the wet and the dry paint. Now, so in this case, I would do the same sort of thing, because I would have then that little bit of linseed oil here that would create a bond between the wet paint and the dry paint. So I'll show you just a little bit of the difference here. The same thing. If I have wet paint on the brush, and let's just go up here, if I try to put that on, you see what happens there? It just wants to drag. It doesn't really want to go on there. Now I'll show you the difference. If I then give it a little bit of a dampness, that's the linseed oil and the Gamsol, and again, need to wipe it down. Of course, if the painting is dry, and this one is 4 years, I mean, if it's not dry by now, it's never going to dry. And wipe that down a bit. Be sure that it's not too wet, because if it's too wet, we'll get the same thing. And then say if I want to make a little edit here, now watch the difference. You see if I put the brush down, see how easily that goes on. So I hope you found this helpful. Make painting a little easier for you and a little more fun. And if there's something that's bothering you, something that you'd like for me to address that might make painting a little easier for you, drop us a comment right down here, and we'll put it on our schedule. And go over to DianeMice.com, take a look at our full-length video tutorials. I think you might find something there that would help out too. And there's your quick tip.